BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Saturday. Welcome to this special weekend presentation of Black Box Online Radio. On the weekends, I've started a new segment about the story of JonBenet Ramsey, perhaps the most famous unsolved homicide in American history, or it's definitely up there with the most famous unsolved homicides. And firstly, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who listened to last week's episode, which was talking about the ransom note. JonBenet Ramsey was murdered in December of 1996, and a 2.5-page ransom note was found at the foot of the stairs that was discovered by her mother, Patsy. And this episode is going to focus on the discovery of JonBenet's body. And her body was found in her own home. She was found in the Ramsey home, in the wine cellar. And I received quite a bit of backlash from you guys here on the channel because one thing that I say very publicly, and it's not a popular standpoint, but I believe that an intruder was responsible for JonBenet's death, and I don't believe that one of the Ramseys, John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsey, was responsible. And this, again, is something that a lot of people will challenge me on. So if you have something to say, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. You can also hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with these true crime discussions. And you can get this show anywhere you get your podcasts for free downloads. Now, to pick up where we left off from last week, JonBenet has gone missing. And there's this ransom note that states that at least 3 people are responsible for her disappearance. It states that there's a letter writer, there are 2 men who are watching over her, and if the Ramseys do not follow their instructions, she will be beheaded. The person who wrote the note made it very clear that they are not one of these 2 people. 2 other men are watching her, so that means there are at least 3 people, but there could be more people involved, because they stated that they were part of a small foreign faction. And this ransom note specifically instructed them not to contact the police, but they did anyway, and Detective Linda Arndt arrived on the scene, and she did give John Ramsey, the father, permission to search the house, and he decided to go against her instructions and search from the basement first, as opposed to searching from the top floor or near the attic the way that Linda Arndt instructed him, and JonBenet was indeed found in the basement, in the wine cellar. And this is going to be something where, even though I just told you that I'm supporting the claim that this was an intruder, I have to evaluate the evidence as I see it, and I have to make these types of evaluations based on my interpretation of the findings. And I've been going through the book Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, hence the name of this segment, The Imperfect Murder, and this part has so many points that make the Ramseys look pretty guilty. For example, as I just said, John Ramsey found JonBenet's body almost too quickly. That's one of them. He's in the basement with his friend Fleet White. He goes around the corner out of sight and discovers JonBenet's body. JonBenet was tied up. Her hands were tied above her head. She was dealing with post-mortem stiffness, so her hands could not be lowered. She also had duct tape over her mouth, and John Ramsey removed the duct tape from JonBenet's mouth, threw it to the side, and then carried her upstairs. Then, with the permission of Detective Linda Arndt, he placed a white blanket over JonBenet's body. Now, I've talked about the FBI profiler John Douglas in the past on Black Box Online Radio. I've actually done 2 episodes previously talking about his JonBenet comments, so I'm going to be very, very brief, but he has a book out there called The Cases That Haunt Us, and there's a section on JonBenet Ramsey. Number 1, he thinks that John Ramsey's actions in the cellar and bringing JonBenet upstairs indicate that he was innocent for the following reasons. Number 1, when John Ramsey, and we can even say Fleet White, found the body, she was not placed in a peaceful or memorial type setting, and when parents murder their children or a family member, they tend to do that based on the accumulation of cases that he has studied in the past. She was just found, as I said, tied up. She had the garrote that had been around her neck, and then the duct tape was over her mouth. So that would indicate that this was not someone who was part of the family. Number 2, John Ramsey removed the duct tape from JonBenet's mouth and dropped it to the floor before he brought her body upstairs. And wouldn't he want to keep the duct tape on her mouth? If he had staged the scene, wouldn't he want everyone to see how he had staged the scene before he started unstaging it, before he started tampering with it? Those are the claims made by John Douglas. Now, the biggest problem that I have with that just as somebody who is reading a book and just wondering, goodness, how does this make any sense at all? You ever have those moments? The whole point would be someone would be trying to make it look like an intruder did it. The whole point would be someone would be trying to make it look like they didn't do it. The whole point would be that someone is trying to make it look like they weren't responsible. So all of these things about, well, if a parent had murdered their kid, wouldn't they do it like this? No, no, no. Throw all of that stuff out there. What does he, let's say hypothetically, if one of the Ramseys were responsible for the murder, would they try to make it painfully obvious that they were responsible? Now, that's mostly about the peaceful setting, and John Douglas does concede in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, that the stuff about the peaceful memorial type setting, well, JonBenet was brought upstairs, and then the white blanket was placed over her. All right, so there is that. Then, number two, that the tape was pulled off and dropped on the floor before everybody had a chance to see it. What I think is very important to remember is sometimes people get in their zone. Sometimes people start acting out a role and they stick to it. Sometimes people get locked into a story and they don't hold back. They don't break free. They will be humming that tune until the day they die. And people can be very deceptive. People can be very convincing actors. And also, if someone is already in the mode of playing the part, then they're going to do things like that. They're not going to be acting, once again, like, how do I make it look like painfully obvious that I committed this crime? No, they're going to try to make it look like someone else didn't. So I had some very big problems with those comments from John Douglas. I completely admit that he knows more about true crime than I do. I completely admit that he's a professional criminal profiler, and I'm not. But those were my immediate responses. And this is just a side note, but I began to think a lot less highly of John Douglas based on some comments that he made in regards to a different case. Every Wednesday I do a segment about the Jack the Ripper story here on Black Box Online Radio. And John Douglas shared the news on his personal Facebook page that the Jack the Ripper mystery had been solved. This is a big news headline that came out about a month and a half ago. And the only source that he had was somebody had contacted him on Facebook Messenger and told him that the Jack the Ripper case had been solved, and they provided a link. And that was all he stated in his post. And I was just thinking, you're not going to try to verify this claim. You're not going to try to see if this is true or false. You're not going to try and see if the media is just making this up, or if they're using half truths and half falsehoods like the way they tend to do. I mean, sometimes the mainstream media will share news stories about a high-profile true crime case being solved when it has not. And that's exactly what happened with the Jack the Ripper case. No, the Jack the Ripper case has not been solved, and it's not even a new news story. They're talking about the mitochondrial DNA findings that were published in a book in 2014. This is a recycled news story. As I said, I began to think less highly of him for that. All right, so another point that is discussed in the book Perfect Murder, Perfect Town that I think makes John Ramsey look a little bit guilty is he tells the authorities that this must be an inside job. This must be someone who had very close and personal knowledge of our house, but the exact words that he says is, this must have been an inside job because he did not talk to people about the wine cellar. It was not something that he regularly talked about, only to people who had been in his house. And the fact that JonBenet's body was found there, I mean, the reason why I say that makes him look a little bit guilty is, I've been following true crime cases for 30 years. I've been exploring true crime content for 30 years, and very frequently, when somebody makes a comment like that, that is almost giving away too much, where it's almost making it look like they know more than they should, or it's making excuses about why things could have happened the way they happened, that tends to show a certain sign of guilt. I remember when I was a kid and I was watching a true crime program, and I can't even remember which one it was, or else I'd tell you, but a woman had committed a murder. She had stabbed someone to death, and she called 911, and she said, oh, I found this dead body. I mean, my family member was dead, and there was a knife, and I picked up the knife, and my fingerprints are going to be on the knife, but I didn't do it. And that is the same type of vibe that I got from the story about John Ramsey here. I mean, oh, it had to have been an inside job. Someone with inside knowledge of our house. Oh, well, how about you, John Ramsey, who lived in the house? And again, I'm still standing by the intruder theory, but this chapter of Perfect Murder, Perfect Town made John Ramsey look extremely guilty. Now, they know that this is a homicide, and it is not a kidnapping. So the authorities began to look at the inner circles. Firstly, I don't think this has anything to do with John Ramsey's tip or John Ramsey's statement. They think that if this has been the murder of a young child, perhaps it was someone who had some type of connection. And it's not only the Ramsey family members. Actually, in the book Perfect Murder, Perfect Town does state that the first people that were looked at were extended family members. Then they began to look at members of Access Graphics. This is the stuff where, things look a little bit better for the Ramseys. I don't know if better is the right word. They look a little bit less guilty as the book goes on because there's a housekeeper named Linda Hoffman Pugh who had a financial dispute with the Ramseys, and her husband was named Merv Pugh. And they both get called in, and Linda Hoffman Pugh is actually asked to give handwriting samples of certain words from the ransom note, and she starts trying to write, but then she's just too overwhelmed with emotion. She says the thought of JonBenet being beheaded makes her break down. This is also very guilty looking. I'm not accusing her directly, but when somebody is asked to give handwriting samples, and they are unable to do so, or they're just refusing to do so, that also looks pretty guilty, and ultimately concludes with the first day ending, and John Ramsey has gone from being very sad to trying to put on a stoic facade throughout the afternoon. We're talking about everything after 1:15 p.m. on the 26th, and then John Ramsey is putting on the stoic facade, and then he goes to bed, by himself, mind you, not with Patsy Ramsey, and as soon as he closes his eyes and leans back, the stoic facade goes away, and he just starts crying. No matter what, he lost his daughter. Rest in peace to JonBenet Ramsey. So, as you see, I'm trying to evaluate each piece of evidence as I can see fit, and I think there is something that would implicate the Ramseys, but I also want these weekend segments here on Black Box Online Radio to focus on your questions and comments, because you guys have been leaving a lot of excellent comments about the case of JonBenet Ramsey, and I want to respond to some of them, because that will make this series very interactive, if you will. And our first comment comes to us from Steve to NE. And it says, "The note was obviously written by Burke, as it's evidenced by its childish content. No adult would have made so many glaring errors. Watch Burke's performance on Dr. Phil. He denies very little." Well, Burke actually did deny the allegations directly on Dr. Phil. The direct question, did you kill JonBenet? He said no. Not that anyone would expect him to say that, yes. But I do disagree that Burke wrote the ransom note. I think the ransom note was written by an adult. I think that it was dictated by a male. The language in the ransom note seems extremely masculine. However, this concept of it being feminine handwriting, that also makes sense to me. And then we have one here from Silver Stuff 182, who says something about the ransom note uses the word attaché. Attaché is also one of those words that is used in film dialogue when discussing transport of ransom money. This word and many others in the note may have entered the writer's consciousness from watching movies. And that is certainly nothing I've come up with. That was noticed 20 years ago. Well, yeah, the fact that the ransom note is using terms like "don't try to grow a brain, John," "don't grow a brain, John," which has been used in other movies that people have tracked it down to. Speed and ransom are the first ones that come to mind. Yes, attaché could be a word that was used in movies. I openly talked about this last week when, yes, I've heard that on television. But thank you, Silver Stuff. Bootsdad13 says, "The dispatcher said something about the call from Patsy Ramsey was off. Because something was. Come on, Ned. Read Foreign Faction by Kolar or Steve Thomas's book. The Ramseys are involved." Well, as I said, this segment about JonBenet Ramsey is just getting started here on Black Box Online Radio, and I'm hoping that this one is going to continue. I would gladly take recommendations. Another book that I've really wanted to read is JonBenet and Lou Smit, because Lou Smit was the detective that was really trying to prove the intruder theory, one that I do seem to support, but I also have found that Lou Smit has not been completely consistent with his stories over the years. There have also been lots of criticisms of Lou Smit, so I would really like to see where that book is going to go. And as you can tell, I try to evaluate these things in an honest way, and if something makes the Ramseys look guilty, I'm not going to ignore it. The next one comes to us from Mark Brenz 9419, and it says, We know that the ransom note was phony baloney, but how did the Ramseys know it was phony? 10 a.m. came and went, with no reaction from the Ramseys. If my child was kidnapped and the kidnapper told me he'd call between 8 and 10 a.m., I'd be glued to my phone. If 10 a.m. came and went, I'd be screaming in anger and frustration. I'd be yelling, "Take my money, I want my daughter." None of that happened. 10 a.m. passed like nothing. Now, I think that when I first read the ransom note, I may have misunderstood this, but it was my interpretation that the call was supposed to become on the next day between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. To say something like, "I'll call you tomorrow." Now, the ransom note was written at night, but I mean, even if I got that wrong, that's the way that it came across to me. So they would have been, or they should have been waiting for a call from the kidnappers the next day, the 27th, not the 26th, but that is just the way that I interpreted it. Charlie J4 S8 says, "Definitely a family member. They didn't even talk to the cops until months later. Their plan was to take her out and not being found in the home, and when Ernst said search the house, John knew the gig was up and found her instantly." I completely agree with the point about him finding her too quickly, but the family wanted to take her out? Now, this is really different because in a lot of the theories involving the parents or Burke being involved, it's that it was an accidental death, or that perhaps Burke did it out in a fit of rage, that Patsy did it in a fit of rage, and they just snapped for a moment, and then they created this weird, bizarre story to try and cover everything up. But that would hardly count as trying to take her out. I mean, especially with the angles involving the parents. Now, there could be some things about how they believe that Jean, or let's not say they believe, because in this hypothetical, if JonBenet were a victim of some type of physical or sexual abuse, and they wanted to cover their tracks, but even that is extremely heinous. And I also don't necessarily think that the actions of the Ramseys on the day that JonBenet was discovered indicate that. But most people, yeah, would say that her death was accidental, that even if somebody hit her, they didn't mean to hit her that hard, and then they panicked and they made this bizarre cover story. And think about what I said about getting locked into a story. Then they just weren't able to back down from that. But I really don't think it's a widely accepted belief that they wanted to take her out like it's some type of bizarre calculated murder. Now, the next one comes to us from John Blues, who says, "I agree with you, Ned. I don't think it was the family, but that's not the popular and sensational take. The evidence points to an intruder. Also, a 7,000 square foot mansion, well, a 7,000 square foot home is a mansion. Probably 15 to 20 rooms, not including the basement and wine cellar. You could be having a party in one wing of the house." Now, I want to share something with you guys. This is purely on a personal note, but I grew up in West Virginia, and in the house that I grew up in, it had a basement. If somebody were just hiding out in the basement late at night while everyone was asleep, and they were just on their little tippy toes moving about, I don't think anyone would have heard them. And that's just a two-story house with a basement and an attic. And I lived in Maryland until I was about 7 years old when my parents got divorced, and we had a split-level house. So, again, it has 2 floors and a basement, and the basement also had a crawl space. I think the exact same thing for the exact same reason. If someone were hiding out there and they were being extremely careful with their footsteps, I don't think anyone would have known that someone was in the basement lurking and moving around. So I think it's entirely possible for somebody to have been hiding out in the Ramsey 7,000 square foot mansion. Now, I told you guys that I was going to share some things that were not the most popular opinions, that were not the most popular viewpoints. And I think that a lot of people interpret the physical evidence and point it toward the Ramseys because it's easier for them to comprehend, it's easier for them to digest. And I know that I'm going to get some backlash for this, but I think it's because they don't like Patsy Ramsey's personality. Secondarily, they don't like Burke's personality. And third, they don't like John Ramsey's personality. And this is one of the things that really set off the investigation, because when Patsy Ramsey first appeared on television, everybody thought that she was drugged up or just appeared extremely sleepy, and something about her personality bothered them. Never mind that she had just lost her daughter. And with Burke, he just seems like he is extremely nervous during interviews. And John Ramsey almost seems like he is too commanding. People think that he's trying to be deceptive. That does not mean for a second, though, that they were responsible for the murder of their daughter. The next one comes to us from Channel, and it says, "I don't know if Linda Arndt not putting her unprovable senses going off in the police report invalidates her credibility. We see the hesitancy and John's influence cast over all levels of justice. This actually goes back to another quotation from John Douglas, and it is that Detective Linda Arndt didn't directly say that John Ramsey is her suspect, but she did talk about how he looked in her eyes with an extremely cold stare, and she was very bothered by that. And what John Douglas said is, that's not evidence that she didn't like the way that someone was looking at her, so she also did not put her suspicions in the report. And I'll give you that one, Channel, because I think what Channel is trying to say is, just because she didn't put it in the report does not mean she did not have these suspicions. And perhaps she also had the ability to differentiate between suspicions and other forms of evidence. Mr. Fairdale says, "Love you, Ned, but this is a swing and a miss. The Ramseys know exactly who did it." Well, it's really interesting that you phrase it that way, because that is the entire focus of the book Presumed Guilty by Stephen Singular, which talks about how there is this extreme dichotomy that goes on with the JonBenet Ramsey case, where some people are saying that the Ramseys are guilty, some people are saying that they're innocent. But what if it's a combination of both? What if they know who did it, but they didn't commit the crimes themselves? And it's going to try and get into how there was this sex ring involved that was connected to high-ranking members of Lockheed Martin, where it would have been absolutely impractical for them to go public with this information. Although I didn't think that book did the most convincing case of that, but this concept of the Ramseys know who did it versus the Ramseys actually did it themselves is explored in Presumed Guilty by Stephen Singular, and I have a multi-part book discussion about that here on Black Box Online Radio, which I invite you to listen to. CCHH says, "The problem that I have with an intruder as a suspect is that it would take a fairly intelligent intruder. The writing is the product of, at least, a slightly above average intellect. Who would take such a risk to write the letter? That just doesn't seem to make any sense, especially given the fact that the little girl was killed inside the house. Even a two-kidnapper scenario defies reason. I suppose that the only way to explain this is that it was a pre-planned kidnapping with an intruder hiding in the house before the family returned that evening, where the note was written beforehand. Nothing else would make any sense. This could coincide with the kidnapper hiding in the guest room closet scenario. Once the family was asleep, he would go forward with his plan. However, that plan ultimately went awry, resulting in the child's death and concealment in the basement, before the killer escaped through the window." Yes. 90% that is what I think happened. I said this all that in last week's episode, but I'll say it again, just in case someone didn't hear that. That is ultimately the theory that I would go with. On the night that JonBenet was murdered, the Ramseys had gone to a Christmas party. John was carrying JonBenet inside, he put her to bed, and I think while they were at the Christmas party, the intruder entered the house. And the intruder was hiding somewhere, and the intruder also knew that they would not be home anytime soon. So to pass the time, the intruder wrote the ransom note. And when you read the estimations, like we even talked about this in one of the sources, one of the articles that I pulled up last week, it would have taken 21 minutes to write the ransom note based on estimations. 21 minutes, that to me sounds like this is somebody who is hiding in the house, trying to pass time, and they also made the garrote from Patsy's paintbrush, and that is also someone who is trying to pass the time. Now, did this person have insider knowledge and familiarity with the house? Well, John Ramsey certainly thought so, but, when he says it like that, that really does make it look bad for him. But mostly this is what I think would happen, that somebody was hiding in the house, then while everybody's asleep, they either did something to JonBenet in her room, or maybe she was already outside of her room. Let's say, for example, she walked down to the kitchen and ate a piece of pineapple, and maybe she just did the kidnapper some type of assistance. Instead of forcing the kidnapper to go upstairs, that person intercepted her while she was eating the pineapple from the table. But I actually think a different thing happened. I think that JonBenet went to sleep for probably 30 minutes, maybe 1 hour, and she just came down and ate a piece of the pineapple that was on the table by herself, and then she went up to her bedroom, went back asleep. Then the killer very, very quietly entered her room, hit her over the head, and then silenced her, and then dragged her to the basement. I don't think that this was any real attempt at a ransom. I think that this was a murder that was planned for someone's own sexual gratification, and they were just simply unable to get JonBenet's body out of the house in a practical way, so they decided to leave her. If you want to challenge me on that, please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Our next one comes to us from Sir Gerbil McIntosh, who says, I lean slightly towards there being an intruder, also with Patsy acting alone coming in second. The most ridiculous theory to me is that Burke did it, and the whole family covered it up. That's one step above the theory that there was an intruder, but it was a space alien. Looking forward to more installments of this series. Well, Sir Gerbil McIntosh, thank you so much for that. And really, I don't think that Burke did it, because that just turns into something where there would have been so many other options. I mean, there have been so many other things. What parents might do in that particular situation is they might fabricate a cover story. Oh, well, she fell down the stairs and hit her head on an object. That's what parents would do, as opposed to putting the garrote around her neck and strangling her, asphyxiating her. That would be purely unnecessary for something like that. But it's an uphill battle to try and convince people otherwise. That Rob guy, or that Rob guy, perhaps. It's hilarious how any sane or somewhat intelligent person says Patsy didn't write that note. It is the most obvious part of the case, and ultimately solves it. Now, again, interpreting the evidence. Patsy does have some similar handwriting, but when they put it under the microscope, I think her handwriting actually looks somewhat different. And furthermore, it has never been conclusively verified that she wrote the note. So, I don't think that we can say that with certainty. Kid Freshie says, stay tuned for Ned's next series. Nicole Brown Simpson's Real Killers Tuesday. Intruder Theory. Really? Come on, bro. Oh, well, if you believe that Nicole Brown Simpson was murdered by an intruder, that's somewhat impossible, because Nicole Brown Simpson was murdered outside. But, I mean, Kid Freshie, what I think you failed to understand is that, yes, O.J. was innocent. He did not commit those murders, and I've gone over it multiple times. You see, what happened with Nicole Brown Simpson was there was a drug debt that was owed by her friend Faye Resnick, and Nicole Brown Simpson had made statements previously that she was going to take care of it. And somebody came over to confront her about the drug debt, and then Ron Goldman just happened to be there at the wrong place at the wrong time, and the altercation kicked off, and they were stabbed to death. And O.J. Simpson had coincidentally been on his way because an individual who is labeled as Charlie told him, hey, you got to come over to Nicole Brown Simpson's house, something's going down, because he knew that there was supposed to be this type of confrontation between the people settling the debt and Nicole. But by the time O.J. got there, everybody was already dead, so OJ's just walking around, panics, and then he got out there as quickly as he could. That explains the footprints, that explains the hat. I'm messing with you. Please don't anyone ever say that OJ committed those murders. I know I shouldn't have joked around about that, but I did. I don't believe that. OJ committed those murders. Thank you, though, for the question, Kid Freshie. I appreciate that. But Kid Freshie, though, says, everybody knows it was a small foreign faction. The note that Patsy wrote even said so. I think one thing, though, that I get into with people who also think that it was an intruder, also are of the opinion that the small foreign faction actually existed. I don't really think that it was a small foreign faction. I think that was just some colorful language that was used on the part of the person who wrote the note. And our next comment comes to us from Classic Chevy Cat, who says, I was wondering how big the Ramsey house was. I had to pause and look. It was 7,240 square feet. The reason I had to look at it is because of your last point about the perp being able to hide in the house, lingering and writing the note. Keep in mind that I am just not very familiar with this case, but I had a problem imagining someone hanging around before or after having murdered someone and writing that note. That just didn't sit well with me. But now that I see how huge the house was, I'm giving it second thoughts. Well, yes, like I said, a 7,000 square foot house. Someone would have been able to hide around. Now, Casbah says, or should I call you Dr. Casbah now? Congrats on your doctorate. You're right. The killer had a key. Walked in the front door. Not Burke did it. Not, Patsy did it. Not Ramsey's did it. Not Intruder did it. But a family friend did it. FFDI. Well, Casbah, someone who would perhaps agree with you is John Ramsey. Think about everything that I just said about how somebody chose to hide her in the wine cellar. John Ramsey had the immediate instinct to say that, okay, this was someone who was familiar with the layout of our house. And yes, Casbah has a suspect in the JonBenet Ramsey case named Bill McReynolds. He's the person who actually played Santa Claus for JonBenet at the party. And lastly, we have one from Pat D here who says, I found out that when the 911 call started, it was recording before the dispatcher answers. Recently, the Ramsey's call was found to be silent until the dispatcher answered. There was a recording of the dispatcher saying that she found it odd how quiet it was until she said something. Then Patsy launched into a real emotional sounding. I'm not sure what to think of it. How did the dispatcher know it was silent before she answered? Do look into the alleged scream. Well, I think that you just gave the perfect answer to that. I mean, how would the dispatcher be able to differentiate between silence or just somebody waiting, or how would she be able to differentiate between dead air and just somebody not talking, or just waiting for the recording to start, or knowing that there wasn't some type of electronic gap in the communication? I think that's a perfect answer. And I mean, maybe Patsy was controlling herself before she heard the voice. Maybe she was just waiting and she wasn't saying anything because there was no one to say it to. Sometimes people will be like that. But what would you like to say? Give me your responses. I would love to read your comments. Maybe your comment will be worked into a future episode of Black Box Online Radio. And to be clear, O.J. Simpson committed those murders. Now, as far as the JonBenet Ramsey case, absolutely. No idea. I cannot tell you who committed it. But as you see, I lean away from the Ramseys. But there are pieces of evidence that do implicate them. Put your ideas in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned DeHaan. There is also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, and I'm on Instagram at blackboxned88. See you over there. Until next time.